Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie and this is Knitting Fundamentals episode 4. If you've been following along in this series of videos, you've learned a lot. You've learned how to buy supplies, do a cast on, do a knit stitch, and now it's time to take a moment and look at the work that you've done and start to understand how to read it. So in this video, we're going to take an in-depth look at garter stitch, and because every project does have to come to an end at some point so that you can start another project, we're going to take a look at binding off your stitches. Before we get started in episode 4, I need to do a little bit of house cleaning. So if you watched my last video, which I'll link up here, which was a chatty what's on my needles, you know that life has been happening for me, which is great. It's great. There's so much going on. I have even more going on in the next couple of months with a couple of family events, and I'm having to reassess and be realistic in terms of my upload schedule. So my goal has been to upload twice a week, Mondays and Fridays, but it's just not totally realistic for myself right now. So I'm committing to uploading an episode a week, and it's going to be in the Knitting Fundamentals series. And then if I can manage to get a second video in at some point during the week, then great, I will do it. I know in my last video I said I was going to do a video on short row heels, and I did shoot it. However, I was editing it and it wasn't up to my standards in terms of a tutorial. I don't feel like I was explaining things as well or as clearly as I could, and my goal is always to be clear. So I have decided I'm going to reshoot it. I am going to get it up in the next couple of weeks. That's as much of a time frame as I'm willing to commit to, is in the next week or two, getting that short row heel video up. I'm really excited about it. I have so much I want to say about my short row heels, but I need to make sure that I'm putting out a video that I can be proud of. So let's get on with the episode. Thank you for listening. As always, I will have timestamps below in the description box so you can skip around to any part of the video that you like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. With all that said, let's talk about garter stitch. If you watched previous episodes, you now know that garter stitch is a stitch pattern that is comprised of all knit stitches, and this is what it looks like. This down here is 2x2 ribbing. All of this above is the garter stitch. There's some really nice qualities about garter stitch. First of all, even though all fabrics have a right side and a wrong side, sometimes you have fabrics like garter stitch which are reversible because it looks the same on both sides. So with garter stitch, what is your right side and what is your wrong side is really knitter's choice. If you've watched my video on longtail cast-on, you know that the longtail cast-on has a distinct knit side and purl side to the cast-on. A lot of times the rule of thumb that people give is that the knit side of the longtail cast-on is the right side of the fabric, and the purl side of the longtail cast-on is the wrong side of the fabric. But in truth, it's knitter's choice. It depends on what you like better, which edge you like better, and what edge you want to show publicly to the world. Next thing about garter stitch to be aware of is how nicely it lays flat. What do you mean, Carrie? What do you mean it lays flat? Doesn't all knitting lay flat? Not necessarily. Here, I have a swatch of unblocked stockinette stitch, and you'll notice when I turn it around, the edges are all curled up here. On this side, the cast on and bind off edges are curling up. So in order to get this to lay flat, I actually need to block it. And that's actually what I did here with this swatch. This is stockinette, and the reason it's not curled up is because of the washing and blocking process. The reason that garter stitch, when you knit this, lays flat, whereas stockinette, which is comprised of alternating rows of knits and purls, curls up has to do with the structure of the knit stitch itself. So knit stitches are not square. They are wider than they are long. And because of that, when you have a fabric like this, where you have all your legs on one side of the fabric and all of your purl bumps and running threads on the other side of the fabric, the tension between the width and the length causes everything to curl up. But in garter stitch, if you look, you'll see this side of the fabric has all purl bumps and running threads exposed. On this side of the fabric, the opposite side, I have an equal number of purl bumps and running stitches. So that balance of the purl bumps being on both sides of the fabric help equalize the width and the height of the individual stitches so that this will lay flat. The last thing to be aware of is that garter stitch vertically has a lot of stretch. Like, look how much I can spread that out, and then it just bounces right back. It's very vertically elastic. Compare that with stockinette, which I can stretch it, but it doesn't stretch as much. The thing is, all that elasticity, right, means that vertically, garter stitch compresses more than stockinette. What this means is it takes more rows of garter to produce 1 inch of fabric than it does stockinette. And you need more yarn for a garter project than a stockinette project. I'm actually going to bring in this little swatch of garter that we are going to be binding off later. When you look at garter stitch, the first thing you'll notice is it has these ridges, right? Each one of these ridges represents 2 rows of knitting. That's really important to understand when it comes time to count these rows. But before we go over counting rows, let's just take a moment and identify the various segments of a knit stitch so that we start training our eyes to be able to see this very clearly without having to think about it. First thing to notice, because these ridges compress together, the legs of an individual stitch get hidden in between those ridges. So to see the leg, you kind of have to stretch the fabric out. So I'm going to stretch this fabric out. And if I look very closely, here is my right leg. Follow that up. Here is my purl bump right here. I follow this down. Here is my left leg. Oops. Oops. There's the left leg right there. Okay. Now I'm going to leave my needle inserted like this in a second because what you cannot see right now on this side of the fabric is where those running stitches are. I'm going to have to turn the work over for that so I can find those running stitches. So here's that stitch that we were looking at. And on this side, we can see the right leg, the left leg. The purl bump is hidden back here, but if we follow this right leg down, here's my right running thread. And here's my left leg, follow that down, and here is my left running thread. So there's the various parts of the stitch. So that's something to be aware of with garter stitch, which is the purl bump will be on one side of the fabric, whereas the left and right running threads will be on the opposite side of the fabric. Sometimes though, when you're looking at it, and not looking so closely, it can be hard to go, okay, wait, I see a whole bunch of bumps. Which ones are the purl stitches and which ones are the running threads? Because, you know, the legs are hidden, there's purl bumps all over here, there's running threads all over here. How do I identify what is a purl bump versus what are the left and right running threads? This little arc here that starts down and goes up and back down again, that's your purl bump. So your purl bump is always the bump that makes the little rainbow. Your running thread, however, is the opposite. The running thread, which is right here and right here, you can always identify those running threads because they're going to make more of a smiley face. Editing Carrie here, I just want to point out quickly that this running thread I'm pointing at is actually the running thread of the stitch in the row above the purl bump that you see on this side of the fabric. If this is really confusing to you right now, don't worry about it. Put a pin in it. Just understand how to identify a purl bump from a running thread. Now, why does it even matter to be able to identify the various segments of the running of the stitch in garter? Well, you need to be able to count your stitches here that are off of the needle. The easiest way to do that with garter stitch is to count your purl bumps. So you want to be able to identify your purl bumps. So I'm going to count my purl bumps. So first thing to know is right here is this edge stitch, right? The edge stitch, that's a little tricky to see, but there is a purl bump. It's right here. So I'm going to just count one for the edge stitch. So that's one. Then I'm going to count, here's this first purl bump I clearly see. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There's my 14th purl bump. And then I have one more edge stitch, so that's 15. If you accidentally confused your purl bumps with your running stitches that are down here and started counting those, one edge stitch, I think this was the purl bump, so that'd be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Wait, what? 16? That doesn't make sense. Remember, there's a left and a right running thread to every stitch, but only one purl bump. So you end up with one extra stitch. But it's not. It's only because you, instead of counting your purl bumps, you counted those running threads. So being able to identify the purl bump versus the running thread is an important thing when you're counting individual stitches. But it's very simple. Your purl bumps are little rainbows, and your running threads are little smiley faces. So there's a couple of rules when we're counting our rows of garter stitch. Rule number 1, the cast on row, unless a pattern says otherwise, does not count as a row of knitting. Rule number 2 is you do count the row of stitches that is on your needle. And then for garter stitch, rule of thumb number 3 is that each ridge of garter stitch is made up of 2 rows of knitting. So if we count each one of our ridges, multiply that by 2, we have the number of rows that we have. So I'm going to start counting some rows. So let's just look at where we're at on this swatch. Right now I am looking at the side of the fabric that represents the even rows of garter stitch. How do I know this? Well, if you recall, I used a long tail cast on to start this little swatch. When you do the long tail cast on, you do your long tail cast on, you turn the work, the purl ridge is what faces you. So that first row of knitting that you do, row 1 of your knitting is the purl ridge. So these represent the odd number rows of garter stitch. And this side is the even number rows of garter stitch. I haven't knit this even row yet, so I don't have a complete ridge here at the top of my needles. I'm going to finish knitting this ridge before I count my rows so that it's just easier to count them. And that's a hint about knitting garter stitch. You want to count your garter stitch rows after you've completed a full ridge. So now I have a full ridge that's here at the top of my needle and I can count my rows. So let's go through the rules. Rule number 1, we do not count the cast on edge. Right here, this is my cast on edge of stitches, so this row doesn't count. Then rule number 2 is we do count the row that is on the needle. So we will be counting this row of stitches. And then rule number 3 for garter stitch is each ridge is 2 rows. So count each ridge and multiply it by 2. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ridges. 8 times 2 is 16. I'm going to knit another row. So now I have 17 rows of stitches. And if I count this side, I just need to be aware that this here is an incomplete ridge. So cast on row, not going to count it. Now I'm going to count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 because it's an incomplete ridge. You now know what you're looking at with garter stitch. You understand some of its characteristics. Maybe you're tired of looking at this swatch that you've been doing and you just are feeling anxious to start something new. Great. Let's talk about ending your knitting by binding off your stitches. There's lots of ways actually that you can bind off your stitches. In knitting, there's lots of ways to start and end your projects, but the method that most people are first taught and is in many ways the easiest to learn right off the bat is doing what's called the chain bind off. Sometimes it's just called the standard bind off because it's so ubiquitous in the knitting world. And in fact, a lot of people only ever learn how to bind off in this way. I knitted for years, and only knew this way to bind off my stitches. It was actually a mind-blowing experience when I discovered there was more than one way to bind off your project. But this is a good one to start with. How you do the chain bind off is very easy. I'm going to knit my first stitch. Easy, I know how to do a knit stitch. And I'm going to knit my second stitch. All right, I have 2 stitches on my right needle. Because we always read knitting from right to left, I count my stitches 1, 2 from right to left. I'm going to take my needle and insert it into that first stitch on my right needle, and I'm going to lift it up and over the second stitch and off. I have 1 stitch bound off, and I have 1 stitch on my right needle. Now I'm going to knit my next stitch. I have once again 2 stitches on my right needle, stitch 1 and stitch 2. I am again going to take my left needle, insert it into that stitch 1, and pass it over stitch 2 and off. And that's all it is. The most common problem with the chain bind off is getting good tension. Something that's very easy to do with the chain bind off is to make it too tight or make it too loose. But the more common problem is to make it too tight. There's a number of reasons why this happens with the chain bind off. So let's just look at some of those. Let's start with when I go to knit the second stitch. You want to make sure both these stitches are fully on the circumference of the needle. That's going to help you create, a properly sized stitch. The next area that you can run into problems is pulling this stitch number 1 over stitch number 2. It's very easy to, as you pull this stitch over, to tighten down on your working yarn, which will tighten up this stitch here that's left on the needle. What you want to make sure you do after you've passed that stitch over is to push this stitch back to the full circumference of the barrel so that you resize this stitch and keep it a good size. The other thing to do sometimes is to just give the fabric a little pull to make sure that it stays nice and evenly tensioned. The next thing that can happen has to do with pulling that stitch over. So here I am. It's very easy to, especially when you first do this, to pull this stitch way up and drag it over. And doing that can actually distort this here. So you just want to, as you're doing this chain bind off, lift up this stitch as little as possible to get it over stitch number 2. Sometimes it can be tricky getting your needle into stitch number 1 to lift it over. The thing you want to do is use the point of the needle to your advantage. Have both stitches here on your tip when you go to pass that stitch 1 over stitch 2. That's going to help you get your right needle into the stitch and lift it up the bare minimum that's necessary to get it up over stitch number 2. But when you're finished, again, make sure you push this stitch back to the full circumference of your barrel. I'm going to just finish binding off these stitches. The other thing too, in terms of binding off, is as you do it, try to keep your hands relaxed and not hold everything with a lot of tension. That's going to help you from tightening everything up. That's going to come with some practice. You know, some of this is just a matter of getting used to the process. Now I've bound off my stitches. And note how I took that last stitch and pulled the yarn to make a big loop so that it doesn't fall out as I cut the yarn. Then all I do is take the working yarn and pull it through like this. And boom, my stitches are bound off. Everything's nice and secure. And if you look, this is pretty squared. Like this edge doesn't flare, which means that you've done the bind off too loosely, and it's not pulling in, which means you've done the bind off too tightly. This edge is the same width as this edge, so I got a good bind off. Now, my bound off edge though, notice I'm going to pull here. It's a little elastic. Notice down here, this is more elastic. That's just the nature of the chain bind off. It doesn't have as much elasticity as the long tail cast on does. By the way, the reason this is called a chain bind off is if you look closely, you can see that it creates a chain of stitches on the top of your knitting. I'm going to be honest, this is not really my favorite bind off to do. If you'd like an alternative method that I actually prefer more, that's called the decrease bind off, I'm going to have a link up here to it. It does involve being able to do a knit 2 together, but you know, if you're learning how to knit from the YouTubes, you are free to try any technique that you want. So if you've bound off your swatch, congratulations, you've finished your first knitted project, your practice swatch. You know, I hope that you actually keep this swatch just as kind of a memento, because it can kind of be fun to look back at where you started and see how far you've come as your knitting improves over time. So we've learned a lot about the knit stitch at this point and the garter stitch, and we've added a new tool to your toolbox, how to bind off. What's next? Well, if you recall, there are 2 stitches in knitting, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. Next episode, we're going to start learning how to do the purl stitch. Yes, yes, the purl stitch. To make sure you don't miss that episode, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weekday, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this, and happy knitting. Bye! Anybody see the Shakira J-Lo halftime show? I still haven't watched, but I have seen the one clip where Shakira does that tongue thing, which I guess is a celebratory thing in cultures, and I'm just like, I don't think I can. I couldn't look that good doing that. Let's just put it that way. However, that's not realistic for myself, for my channel. Okay. And you know, if you're awesome. So I'll do it. Oops, I have a dropped stitch. But the chain, even though the chain the reason the chain bind off. So yeah, I don't know what I'm saying. Forget it.